15 minutes, I wish to introduce the research project I am currently conducting at Ghent University as a PhD student. The research project I'm working on deals with the historical novel as a genre within the Émigré community of the interwar years. The project focuses on questions of historical representation in these novels, but also seeks to advance insights on the Émigré community as a whole. How do these novels relate to the literary developments in the Émigré community? And how do these novels relate to the changing historical perspectives of that era? And how do they relate to the community's emerging and divergent narratives of identity, belonging, and mission? The research project therefore seeks to analyze these novels in their contexts, focusing primarily on the context of exile and interwar Europe. By ways of introduction, I would like to introduce one of the perspectives I have chosen with which I contextualize these historical novels. This perspective is related to the context of Russian Émigré community of the interwar years and can therefore maybe be of relevance for discussions in this symposium. A consequence of taking a genre as a research focus is that the corpus will consist of a wide range of authors and different kinds of historical novels. Indeed, when we take a closer look at the individual authors, a picture arises as diverse as the Émigré community itself. Mark Aldanov, Nina Berberova, Roman Gul, Piotr Krasnov, Ivan Lukács, and so forth. These authors, however, in spite of their apparent differences, do share some important characteristics. They were Russian exiles, they wrote during the interwar years, and for whatever reasons, they were interested in the writing of historical fiction in this period. It is therefore precisely the context that allows for an integration of these seemingly divergent works into a meaningful scholarly work. In my project, I characterize this context as one permeated by a sense of crisis. This sense is caused by a perceived loss or a fear of losing a past that no longer seems relevant to the present. Interwar Europe was a context that often portrayed itself as being in a crisis, and the Russian émigrés were no exception to this. Even more so, it can be argued, their experiences of a loss of homeland, a loss of history, as Bunin once said, and exile made them more susceptible to perceptions of being in a crisis. Crisis, however, is an ambiguous concept, especially when it is applied to the present. In a sense, it is a discursive concept that allows for a positioning of the self vis-à-vis the other, of taking control over the narrative, of regaining agency. It is a concept that implies, so crisis is a concept that implies an assessment of the present, an analysis of the past, and an imagining of the future. It's a concept, in short, that has both positive and negative connotations, an acknowledgement of having lost control on the one side, and an impetus to regain control on the other side. Two fields in which this crisis talk was going on are especially relevant for the analysis of the historical novel of the Russian émigré. First of all, a crisis in history, and secondly, a crisis of literature, the so-called crisis of the novel. Because of the limited time on hand, I will focus on the context of a perceived crisis of history right now. Concerning the literary context, I would just like to say that in my research project, I would like to add to the perspectives and insights of the works of Leonid Livak, Olga Demidova, Greta Slobin, and Maria Rubins, who interpreted, very broadly speaking, literary works, debates, and criticism of the émigré community through the lens of identity construction in exile. The debates on the mission of the émigré community, debates on Russianness, debates on Russian literature and the end of émigré literature, debates on the end of fiction in general, as discussed by these scholars, are relevant to this research project as well as their perspectives from exile, diaspora, and transnational studies. But, as I said, in what follows, I will focus on the context of a perceived crisis of history. In the wake of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, historical knowledge, conceptions of the historical process, the idea of progress and the value of historicism and positivism were widely discussed among European intellectuals with a profound sense of crisis. These discussions occurred throughout the continent, as can be attested by such critics as Paul Valéry and Walter Benjamin, but the sense of crisis of history also permeated in discussions among Russian intellectuals. The interwar years were a period in which these intellectuals revalued history and historical knowledge and sought to reimagine the properties of history because of the destructive historical events that they had lived through. Their reactions and ideas, however, were often divergent. I will give 3 examples now of divergent historical thought to give a sense of how history was revalued. Piotr Bicili, for instance, the historic of literature, observes in his article «Кризис истории», «Прошла та пора, когда история была залогом веры в лучшее светлое будущее или тем прибежищем, где искали отдохновение от современной жизни». According to Bicili, the idea of progress, one of the guiding meta-historical conceptions of historical process throughout the 19th century, no longer seems relevant in his time. But his loss in the belief of progress, however, does not weaken a general sense of being part of a historical process. Quite to the contrary, the individual more than ever seems to be aware of his lack of historical agency, of being swept up by some kind of historical process. This process, however, has no direction anymore, according to Bicili, has no progress anymore. A second example is, of course, the religious philosopher Nikolai Birjayat, who in Smysl'istorie calls for a reimagining of the historical process, for a reimagining of a philosophy of history that would give meaning to the lives in the present. In this work, in Smysl'istorie, he insists that the time has come to abandon the idea of progress and to create a new history of philosophy. Birjayat contends that his own time is a time of vast historical rupture, in which a new historical era has begun and in which the pace of historical development has changed considerably. According to Birjayat, people are becoming more and more aware of living in such a time of historical rupture. As such, Birjayat claims that such periods of historical rupture encourage human thought and consciousness to revise the fundamental questions of the philosophy of history and to attempt to build a philosophy of history completely anew. A third one is Vladimir Nabokov, who scorns historical science for categorizing, interpreting, and labeling the past in his lecture on generalities. He calls this historical science a demon обобщений. This demon gives people the wrong sense that they do not have any historical agency, that no matter what they do, they are part of some process they cannot escape or resist. And even worse, according to Nabokov, is that the historical knowledge causes people to see the present as part of this process as well, and because of that, negatively assess this present. According to Nabokov, this present is wonderful and should not be scolded at. Other examples can be added to the list as well, but the point I want to make here is that the Émigré historical novel was written in a period when novel conceptualizations of history were proposed in reaction to the dominant historical perspectives of the 19th century. The First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and Exile, these historical events, together with the crisis of that era, like the crisis of faith, for instance, the crisis of reason, the crisis of the empire, these crises that, according to Pericles Lewis, had caused the crisis of representation, fundamental to literary modernism, these events and crises had caused many a Russian thinker to value historical knowledge differently from the past. Because of this, the historical process was often imagined in novel ways. For Piotr Bicili, the historical process was omnipresent, but without any direction. Birjayat sought to reimagine the historical process, while Nabokov urged his fellow émigrés not to let conceptions of the past ruin a joyous living in the present. For all three, a tension existed between historical thought and the present. According to the contemporary theoretic of history, François Hartog, interwar Europe was experiencing what he calls a minor crisis of time. In his work, Regimes of Historicity, Hartog argues that in this period, the dominant conception of time, one that was oriented towards the future and allowed for the concept of progress, a history as such with a teleological purpose, was no longer widely shared, and that its conception of progress came under attack. This future-oriented conception of time, however, persisted as well. Crisis of time means that this was a period in which old and new conceptions of time existed side by side in dialogue or conflict with each other. It was a period, therefore, in which such diverse historical thoughts could surface as the examples above show. This context makes an inquiry into the historical novel compelling, especially when it concerns questions of historical representation. I would like to end with a brief example, although this schematic discussion of the historiosophical conceptions of a single author will probably raise more questions than give answers, so feel free to ask those questions if you have them. Ivan Najivin wrote several historical novels set in ancient times while in emigration. Three of these, Evangeliat van Mui, Julie, Liliantinoia, concern the period of early Christianity, while Rastici van Norcheloses deals with Moses and the story of Exodus, and Sachisti with ancient Greek during the Peloponnesian Wars. In these novels, a clear conception of the historical process emerges. Constitutive to this historical process is the idea that mankind cannot attain true knowledge, istina, through language. Mankind, nevertheless, is compelled to create truth through language, and through these created truths, power relations, that is, ideologies, religions, political systems, emerge. These systems then oppress the masses. Sometimes, though, the masses revolt against these oppressive systems imposed by a created truth. But they can do so only by a created truth of their own, a truth that promises a better life. And when this newly created truth manages to overthrow the dominant created truth and the power that comes with it, this new truth will create new power relations from its own truth that inevitably become oppressive as well. Thus, history is imagined as one of alternating between periods of consolidation of a new truth, and with that repression, and periods of societal upheaval and resistance or revolution to this old truth and the creation of a new one. In the cyclical conception of history, the individual is stripped from his agency. Mankind is caught up in its own truths, which are a prison house, especially for those not in power. We can already sense Najivin's own time in here, a critique of the Russian Revolution, which, according to his conception of the historical process, will not lead to progress, but to new repression. In such a conception of history, it can be argued the Bolsheviks, too, essentially lack historical agency, even though they present their own actions as taking the historical process in their own hands. Their actions, rather, are invoked by history itself. They too are, according to Najivin's historical conception, prisoners of the same process. Moreover, the same can be said of émigrés, for whom resistance against the Soviet Union, according to Najivin's conception of the historical process, is futile. In these novels, however, there is still hope for a way out of the prison of a cyclical historical process. An individual can, through isolation and introspection, become aware of an ineffable, transcendental truth. This truth is attained in the here and now through isolation, introspection, and a confrontation with beauty. This attained universal and ahistorical truth of the individual is opposed in the novels to the prison of a created, contingent, subjective, and relative truth the masses live in. An escape from the historical process is therefore only attainable by excluding oneself from this process, by stepping outside of history, as it were. It is not a path for the many and implies choosing a life of seclusion, introspection, and a living in the here and now, free from the wish to change the world through words. As we can see, some of the previously discussed characteristics of this period return. Through a rejection of the dominant idea of progress, Najivin reimagines the historical process. This process is, in the case of Najivin, cyclical, with the individual lacking any agency. At the same time, however, the ideas presented in the novel also allow for a way out through a rejection of history by placing oneself outside of the historical. The historical process, as imagined by Najivin, is capable of crushing the individual, but the individual can resist this process not by confronting the process itself, but by escaping it. As such, a perceived redundancy of the past conception of progress, the crisis of progress, allows for a reimagining of the historical process and the proposition for a way out, a solution for the crisis. Because these distant historical periods are represented in ways strongly reminiscent of Najib's own time, these novels can be interpreted as commenting on the revolutionary period as well. With this, I wish to conclude this short introduction to one of the perspectives I have chosen for the contextualization of the historical novels. Thank you for listening. And I would like to thank the organization as well for organizing this symposium. Thank you.